The story began, as all tragedies and miracles do, with a promise made by others. Long before Lady Arabella Whitmore could speak her own name, her father had sealed her fate with ink and ambition, an agreement that joined her cradle to the cradle of another child, the heir to the dukedom of Pembroke. The contract had been drawn up not in affection, but in arithmetic, titles, estates, and legacies measured in signatures. Love, Lord Whitmore used to say, is for poets. Marriage is for preservation. And so, while other girls grew up dreaming of affection, Arabella grew up learning composure. She learned how to curtsy, how to smile without feeling, and how to silence her heart. She never met her intended husband, only heard of him through polite correspondence, the future Duke Edward Pembroke, a man described as brilliant, responsible, and, titled by every mother in London, the very image of rank and refinement. She was told to be grateful. She would one day be a duchess. That should have been enough. The day she was to be escorted to Pembroke Hall dawned soft and golden, a summer morning that smelled of roses and endings. Her trunks had been packed the night before. Her lady's maid wept softly as she folded the last gown. Arabella, ever calm, stood before her mirror and stared at her reflection. Pale silk, pale pearls, pale resolve. When the carriage arrived, her father's steward announced, "Lord Henry Pembroke, my lady." For a moment, her composure wavered. Henry? She had expected a duke, not a lord. When the door opened, she saw a man standing in the sunlight, tall, broad-shouldered, and undeniably handsome, with dark hair tousled by the wind and a smile that reached his eyes. He bowed with a warmth that startled her. "Lady Arabella," he said, voice smooth but unpretentious, "I'm sent to accompany you to Pembroke Hall. My brother regrets he could not come himself. Urgent matters in Parliament, you see." His tone carried no apology, only wry amusement. Arabella inclined her head, schooling her face into polite neutrality. "Of course," she replied. "It is an honour, my lord." When he looked up, something flickered in his gaze, something curious, alive, human. "The honour," he said quietly, "may yet be mine." The journey began under a sky streaked with silver clouds. Arabella sat primly in the carriage, gloved hands resting atop her lap, every inch the dutiful betrothed. Henry, by contrast, leaned casually against the seat, his long legs stretched out, his demeanour far too relaxed for a man of his standing. For the first hour they spoke little. Polite courtesies, meaningless talk about the weather and the road. But Henry was not a man who tolerated silence long. "Tell me, my lady," he said with a teasing lilt, "how does it feel to be promised to a man you've never met?" She blinked, taken aback. "It feels expected." He laughed softly, tilting his head. "Expected? That's all?" Arabella's tone turned crisp. "It is not my place to question expectation." "Perhaps not," he said, smiling faintly. "But it seems a dreadful way to live, never questioning." Her gaze shifted to the window. "Questioning makes people unhappy." "Or free," he countered. She glanced back at him then, surprised by the softness behind the jest. For the first time, she noticed the contrast between them, her restraint and his ease, her cold composure against his warmth. It unsettled her, this stranger with her fiancé's name attached to him. By the second day of travel, the tension had transformed into something else, not discomfort, but awareness. He teased her gently, she deflected with precision, and somewhere between laughter and silence, a thread began to weave itself between them. At an inn outside Bath, a sudden rainstorm forced them to take shelter. The inn was small, the fire bright, and when he offered her a seat beside him, she hesitated before accepting. He poured her tea with unstudied grace, saying, "You must find me terribly improper, Lady Arabella." She arched a delicate brow. "Only occasionally, my lord." He laughed again, a real, unguarded sound that sent warmth through the room, and something through her chest she did not dare name. For a moment she almost forgot that the man across from her was not the one she was promised to. That night, as the rain drummed softly on the window, Arabella lay awake in her chamber at the inn, listening to the faint sound of his laughter drifting from below. She pressed a hand to her heart, irritated by its restlessness. She reminded herself of her duty, of the Duke waiting at Pembroke, of the future that had been written for her before she was born. But the image that lingered behind her closed eyes was not of the Duke. It was of his brother, his easy smile, his thoughtful gaze, his voice when he said her name, as though he were discovering it for the first time. When she finally slept, her dreams were filled not with titles or ballrooms, but with the sound of the rain and the feeling of something dangerous beginning to bloom. By the time the carriage reached the grand gates of Pembroke Hall, Arabella had memorized every detail of Henry's manner, the way he tugged his gloves when nervous, the half-smile that betrayed sincerity. She told herself it was curiosity. It felt like warning. The manor rose before them like something out of legend, vast, ancient, beautiful. Yet as the carriage rolled to a stop, Arabella's unease grew. The servants bowed, the gates opened, and standing at the top of the marble steps was a man dressed in black. Tall, severe, and expressionless. "The Duke of Pembroke," Henry murmured beside her, his voice quiet, but tinged with something unreadable. Her heart sank. She had not yet stepped into her new life, and already she knew. The man she was bound to by birth was not the one her soul recognized. And though she did not yet understand it, that difference between what was promised and what was meant would change everything. The carriage rattled along the winding country road, the rhythm of the wheels a counterpoint to Arabella Whitmore's thoughts. The sky stretched wide and pale above them, the kind of fragile English blue that promised fair weather but hid a storm beneath. Inside, the air was close, thick with the scent of leather and lilacs, and something unspoken between her and the man seated opposite. Lord Henry Pembroke sat as though the carriage were his kingdom, relaxed, legs stretched, one arm resting casually along the seat. He seemed entirely untroubled by the formality that pressed against her like a second skin. Arabella, upright and still, stared out the window, pretending interest in the passing fields. Yet every time he shifted, every time his voice broke the silence, she felt the air change. "So," he began, that irreverent smile curving his lips, "have you always been this dreadfully proper, my lady, or is it a condition brought on by proximity to me?" Her gaze flicked toward him. "I assure you, my lord, propriety has served me quite well." He chuckled softly. "Has it? You make it sound like armor." She folded her hands in her lap, unamused. "Perhaps it is." Henry tilted his head, studying her. "A pity. Armor tends to keep both swords and sunshine out." The remark startled her, not for its boldness, but for its truth. She turned back to the window before he could see her expression. "Not all of us can afford to live unguarded, my lord." "Then perhaps," he murmured, "you've simply never met someone worth lowering the guard for." She did not answer. The silence that followed was not empty. It hummed, alive and dangerous. By the second day the road grew rougher, forcing the carriage to slow. They stopped at a small coaching inn to rest, a humble place compared to the world they both came from. Rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then in steady sheets that blurred the countryside. Inside, the inn was warm, fire crackling, the scent of roast bread and wood smoke filling the air. When the innkeeper apologized for the delay, Arabella merely nodded. "We will dine while we wait." Henry, however, grinned. "Excellent. I do my best thinking on an empty stomach, which coincidentally is also my worst thinking." She gave a reluctant smile, one she quickly hid behind her teacup. He saw it anyway. "You can smile," he said, mock astonishment in his tone. "I was beginning to think it required divine intervention." "Careful, my lord," she replied smoothly, "or I might remind you that I'm promised to your brother." The words landed harder than she intended. His smile faltered, just slightly, before he forced it back. "Of course," he said quietly. "How could I forget?" The sudden sincerity in his tone unsettled her. For the rest of the meal, she found herself watching him from beneath her lashes, noticing the way his humor masked thought, the way his laughter never quite reached his eyes. When they departed the inn hours later, the rain had worsened. The roads were slick, the horses uneasy. Twice the carriage wheels sank into the mud, forcing them to stop. The second time, Henry insisted on stepping out to help the coachman. "You'll ruin your boots," she protested, peering out the window. He grinned up at her from the rain. "Then I shall consider them a noble sacrifice." When he returned, dripping and flushed from effort, she handed him a towel without a word. Their fingers brushed. The briefest touch, yet her heart stuttered as if struck. That night they took shelter in another inn, smaller, quieter. Only one room remained. The innkeeper blushed, offering to set up a screen and separate cots. Henry, ever gallant, insisted she take the bed. "I'll manage by the fire," he said, though his eyes gleamed with mischief. "You may rest easy. My reputation can withstand a night on hard floorboards." "Can it?" she asked dryly. "Barely," he admitted, laughing. Later, as the wind rattled the shutters, Arabella lay awake, the sound of rain mingling with his steady breathing from across the room. Sleep eluded her. She thought of her betrothed, the man she had never met, whose name carried the weight of her future. And then she thought of the man by the fire, his laughter, his warmth, his maddening honesty. She wondered if her heart could truly distinguish between what was promised and what was right. The next morning, when the sun rose pale and uncertain, they rode in silence again. But the quiet between them had changed. It was not distance now, and it was tension, the kind that deepens rather than fades. At a stop near the Pembroke border, Arabella stepped out to stretch her legs. The air smelled of wet earth and roses. Henry joined her, his hands in his coat pockets. "You'll see Pembroke Hall soon," he said softly. "It's grand, though not always kind." She turned to him. "And your brother, the Duke, he will be kind?" Henry hesitated. The question struck deeper than she knew. "He will be everything expected of him." "That isn't the same thing." "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." Their eyes met, the truth unspoken between them. For a moment it felt as though the world held its breath. Then a distant bell rang from the hills, the sound of Pembroke calling them forward, reminding them both of what they could not have. As the carriage crested the final hill, Pembroke Hall came into view, vast and imposing, its grey stone walls glowing faintly in the afternoon light. Arabella drew in a slow breath. "This is it," Henry said, his voice low. "Yes," she whispered. "My future." But as she looked out over the endless gardens and glittering windows, she could not help but feel that she was crossing into something far more dangerous than destiny, something alive, unpredictable, and heartbreakingly human. And though she did not yet know it, The road she had travelled with the wrong brother was the only road that would ever lead her home. When Lady Arabella Whitmore stepped through the grand doors of Pembroke Hall, the weight of her future pressed down with every echoing step. The marble floors gleamed, portraits of ancestors lined the walls, all the solemn grandeur of a dynasty untouched by warmth. At the top of the staircase stood Edward Pembroke, the Duke she had been promised to since birth. He was everything the Ton admired and everything Arabella feared. His bearing was flawless, his posture precise, his eyes calculating. The first thing he gave her was not a smile, but an appraisal. "So," he said coolly, "my future Duchess." The words should have thrilled her. After all, they fulfilled the promise of her childhood. But instead, they settled like ice in her veins. "My lord," she said, curtsying with practised grace, "it is an honour to finally meet you." He nodded once. "I trust my brother treated you with respect during your journey." Before she could answer, Henry, standing a few paces behind, replied evenly, "With more than you seem inclined to show her." A flicker, the briefest tightening around Edward's mouth, betrayed annoyance. "Ever the gallant, Henry," he said softly. "You forget your place." "And you forget your manners," Henry murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. The tension between the brothers was almost tangible. Arabella, caught between pride and discomfort, forced a polite smile. "Your Grace," she said gently, "the journey was quite pleasant." Edward's attention returned to her, sharp and assessing. "Good. You'll find Pembroke Hall a place of discipline and order. I expect my Duchess to embody both." It was not a welcome. It was a command. Dinner that evening was a lesson in silence. The Duke spoke of estate matters and political acquaintances. Arabella listened, nodded, and smiled when required. Henry, seated at the far end of the table, said little, but his gaze, when it met hers, held a quiet apology. Afterward, when the guests withdrew, Arabella wandered into the gallery, her footsteps echoing softly against marble. She paused before a portrait, a family painting, clearly from years past. Two boys stood beside a stately woman with kind eyes. The older boy, Edward, already carried the stiffness of expectation. The younger, Henry, had laughter in his eyes even as a child. "You see the difference," came a voice behind her. She turned to find Henry watching her, arms folded loosely, expression wistful. "They painted us like that when I was 10, he said. "My mother insisted we hold hands. Edward hated it. He said it made him look weak." Arabella glanced at the painting again. "And you?" He smiled faintly. "I thought it made us look like brothers." The quiet honesty in his tone made her chest tighten. She looked away before he could see it. "Your brother values perfection above sentiment." "He values control," Henry corrected softly. "The difference is subtle, but deadly." Their eyes met, a moment suspended in fragile balance. She should have stepped back. Instead, she found herself whispering, "You two are so different." He gave a small, sad laugh. "And yet fate insists she promised you to him." Her heart stumbled at the sound of that word, fate. The days that followed blurred into a strange rhythm. The Duke entertained political guests, spoke to her only in formality, and treated her affection as though it were a coin to be earned. When she expressed interest in the estate gardens, he scoffed, saying, "Duchesses are not gardeners." But Henry walked with her through the roses, laughing as she stooped to touch the petals. He listened when she spoke, remembered when she smiled. The servants began to notice, whispers in the halls, stolen glances in the drawing room. At first, she told herself it was harmless. They were merely companions, two kindred souls trapped within the same gilded cage. But one afternoon, as they stood beneath the great willow by the pond, she felt something shift irrevocably. She had been sketching the landscape, her parasol open beside her, when Henry leaned over her shoulder to look. "You have talent," he said softly. "This is beautiful." She laughed nervously. "It's nothing, truly." "Nothing?" His voice lowered, his breath brushing her ear. "Then I pity every man too blind to see what nothing looks like." The compliment struck her like thunder. She turned, startled, too quickly. Their faces were suddenly inches apart. His hand rose as if to steady her, then stopped, hovering near her cheek, trembling with restraint. The air between them grew heavy, the kind that exists before storms and confessions. "Arabella," he began, his voice breaking on her name, the first time he had spoken it without title. She pulled back, pulse racing. "You mustn't," she whispered. "You know we cannot." He stepped back instantly, jaw tightening. "Forgive me. I forget myself." Her throat ached. "No," she said softly. "You remember yourself too well." He looked at her then, truly looked, as if she were the only thing in the world that made sense. And in that gaze, she felt everything she had been taught to suppress: desire, defiance, and the terrifying sweetness of being seen. That evening she sat across from the Duke at supper, pretending composure while her thoughts burned. Edward spoke of schedules and alliances, of their impending wedding, as if it were a trade agreement. "You will find," he said casually, "that loyalty is the foundation of a strong union. Love is ornamental." Arabella forced a smile, her fingers tightening around her glass. "Then I hope, Your Grace, that your loyalty will not falter when tested." The remark earned her a glare sharp enough to cut glass. Across the table, Henry's jaw flexed, but he said nothing. Later that night, she stood alone in her chambers, staring at her reflection. The jewels at her throat gleamed coldly in the candlelight, symbols of a life built on promises she no longer believed in. She remembered Henry's words by the pond. "I pity every man too blind to see what nothing looks like." And for the first time in her life, Lady Arabella Whitmore realized she was no longer afraid of disobedience. She was afraid of losing the one person who made her feel alive. The evening of the Duke's grand ball began with diamonds and deception. Lady Arabella Whitmore, resplendent in ivory silk, descended the staircase of Pembroke Hall beneath a cascade of candlelight, her heart steady but her spirit restless. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and gossip. The ton's finest gathered to witness the soon-to-be Duchess of Pembroke, unaware that the woman they admired was unravelling beneath her corseted composure. The Duke, Edward Pembroke, was in rare form that night, charming, controlled, and entirely insincere. He introduced her to lords and ladies like a collector presenting a prize. Every bow and curtsy felt like another link in the chain around her throat. "You will dance with Lord Beresford next," Edward said lightly, his gloved hand barely touching hers. "He is influential. I trust you know how to be agreeable." Arabella's smile did not reach her eyes. "As you wish, Your Grace." From across the room she caught Henry's gaze, standing at the edge of the ballroom, half in shadow. He looked at her as if the room did not exist, his expression unreadable, his jaw set. Their eyes met for only a moment before he turned away. And yet that brief glance sent something through her like lightning. The dance passed in a blur of polite conversation and stifled laughter. She heard herself replying to Lord Beresford, her voice distant, her mind elsewhere. She had spent weeks trying to ignore the truth, that her heart quickened not for the Duke she was bound to, but for the man she could never have. When the waltz ended, she escaped to the terrace, the night air cool against her flushed skin. The gardens stretched dark and silent, the sound of distant violins drifting through open windows. She closed her eyes, exhaling the weight of pretense. "You shouldn't be alone," said a voice behind her. She turned sharply. Henry stood there, the moonlight catching in his hair, his expression tight with restraint. "I could say the same of you," she replied softly. "Does your brother know you've left his court of admirers?" He gave a humorless laugh. "He'd hardly notice. His gaze is fixed too high for human things." She tried to smile, but the ache in his voice silenced her. For a long moment neither spoke. The distance between them felt fragile, a thread that could snap or pull them closer with the slightest movement. "Arabella," he said quietly, her name falling from his lips like a prayer. "I can't do this anymore." Her breath caught. "Do what?" "Pretend," he said. "Pretend I don't see you in every room, in every word I shouldn't say. Pretend I can stand beside you and feel nothing." She shook her head, her heart pounding. "You mustn't. You know what's at stake." "I know," he whispered. "And I know that every day I watch you fade a little more in his shadow. You were meant for laughter, for sunlight, not for his pride." She turned away, gripping the stone railing. "You think I don't know that?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel his breath, the warmth of him. "Then leave him." Her voice trembled. "And bring ruin on my family? Destroy everything they built?" He hesitated, his voice low. "Then let me bear it with you." She looked up at him, her tears glinting in the moonlight. "You're asking me to choose between honor and happiness." He shook his head. "I'm asking you to remember that one without the other isn't living." And then, before either of them could think, before duty could silence desire, he kissed her. It was not gentle nor desperate. It was everything between, a confession long withheld, an apology unspoken. The world fell away, the music, the whispers, the consequence. There was only the heat of his hand at her waist, the tremor of her fingers in his hair, the taste of rain and forgiveness. When they broke apart, both were trembling. The enormity of what they'd done, settling like thunder in the space between them. "We mustn't," she whispered, her lips still close to his. "I know," he said hoarsely. "But tell me you don't feel it and that this is not the truth we've both been running from." Her eyes closed. "Feeling something doesn't make it right." "No," he said, "but it makes it real." And then, a voice. "Well," said Edward Pembroke, stepping from the shadows of the terrace. "Isn't this touching?" Arabella froze. Henry's hand fell away from hers instantly, his face draining of colour. The Duke's expression was eerily calm, his tone clipped. "My fiancé and my brother." "What an enlightening tableau." "Edward," Henry began, "it's not what you think." "Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like." His gaze shifted to Arabella, cold and gleaming. "I trusted you to represent this family with grace. I see now I was mistaken." Her throat tightened. "Your Grace, please." He raised a hand, silencing her. "You will not speak. You will not be seen. From this moment our engagement is suspended." The cruelty in his voice was quieter than anger, therefore more terrifying. Turning to Henry, he added softly, "You've managed to disgrace yourself and your bloodline in one breath. Congratulations, brother." Then, with a curt nod, he left, his footsteps vanishing into the echo of music and scandal. Arabella sank to the ground, her gown pooling around her like spilled light. Henry knelt beside her, his hand trembling as it hovered over hers. "I'll fix this," he said, his voice shaking. "I swear to you." She pulled away, tears burning her cheeks. "You can't fix what was never supposed to happen." He tried to speak, but she turned from him, her voice breaking. "Go. Please, before you make it worse." When he finally obeyed, vanishing into the night, she pressed her palms against the cold stone and whispered to the empty air, "I was promised to one duke and cursed to love another." And somewhere inside the glittering halls, the first rumors began to spread. The whispers that would soon grow into ruin. The scandal spread faster than the dawn. By morning, Pembroke Hall was a palace of whispers. Servants scurried through corridors with wide eyes, the ton's gossips swarmed the gates like vultures, and the newspapers carried veiled insinuations about a certain lady of rank and the Duke's charming brother. Lady Arabella Whitmore stayed locked in her chamber, her tea untouched, her heart hollow. The ball's glitter had turned to ash overnight. The world outside her door no longer whispered her name with admiration, but with pity and contempt. From the courtyard below came the sound of hooves. Lord Henry Pembroke was leaving. She heard the muffled exchange through the window, Edward's cold, measured tone, Henry's defiant anger. "You'll not take another step toward her," the Duke ordered, voice like iron. "You've done enough." "She's blameless," Henry shot back. "If the world must condemn someone, let it be me." Edward's laugh was low and cruel. "How noble!" "Unfortunately, nobility doesn't suit bastards." The silence that followed struck like thunder. "What did you say?" Henry demanded. Edward's voice softened, poisonous. "Did you think I didn't know? Our father was a fool, and your mother worse. A dalliance, nothing more. You were born of it. You may bear our name, but you are no true Pembroke." The words landed with precision, meant to wound, to end. Henry's reply was a whisper of disbelief. "You're lying!" Edward's smirk carried centuries of arrogance. "Am I? Ask the archives. The proof lies there, signed by father's own hand," though he was too weak to declare it publicly. Then came the sound of fists, a brief, desperate struggle, and finally the crash of the great doors as Henry left the manor, the horses galloping into the storm. Arabella sank to her knees beside the window, trembling. In that single moment, she understood the scandal was not their greatest sin. The truth was, the wrong brother held the title, and the right one had been driven away by lies. Hours later, unable to bear the stillness, she went to the Pembroke archives, a place the Duke seldom visited. The room smelled of dust and ink, the shelves stacked with ledgers and correspondence dating back generations. She searched through drawers and boxes until her fingers ached, and there at last she found it. A letter. Yellowed, frayed at the edges, but sealed with the Pembroke crest. She broke it open with trembling hands. "To my sons Edward and Henry, should Providence take me before truth prevails, know this. Henry is of my blood as surely as Edward. His mother was my lawful wife, though the marriage was kept secret to protect her family's honor. Let no man deny his name or inheritance, for to do so would betray both God and lineage." The ink had faded, but the truth blazed clear. Henry was not the bastard, he was the rightful heir. Edward had built his empire upon a lie. Arabella pressed the letter to her chest, her breath coming quick and shallow. Her mind raced. She could expose him, restore Henry's honor, perhaps even free herself from the chains of this cursed engagement. But doing so would destroy a powerful man and make her the weapon of his ruin. Still, she could not stand by in silence, not any more. That evening she went to the Duke's study. He sat by the fire, swirling brandy in his glass, every inch the picture of control. "You should have left by now," he said without looking up. "Your presence invites disgrace." "Then perhaps," she said coldly, "I've learned from my betrothed." His gaze flicked toward her, sharp as glass. "Careful, my dear, you have little ground to stand on." She laid the letter on his desk. "Then perhaps this will give me some." He frowned, scanning the parchment. And for the first time, the mask cracked, his color drained, his jaw tightened. "Where did you find this?" "In your father's archives," she said, "hidden beneath the ledgers you so carefully preserved." He laughed once, hollow. "You think this will save him? That old fool's word against mine?" "It's not his word that condemns you," she said softly. "It's yours. You've built your title on deceit. And if I expose you, not even your fortune will shield you from disgrace." He stood, fury radiating from him. "You dare threaten me!" She met his rage without flinching. "No! I promise you the truth, something you've never had the courage to face." For a moment, they stared at one another, predator and prey, though it was no longer clear who was which. Then, without warning, he seized her wrist. "You will stay silent." She wrenched free, her voice trembling but resolute. "No, I will not be the Duchess of a lie." He glared at her, his voice low. "You would destroy a man's life for a romantic illusion?" "No," she said quietly. "I would save the only man who's ever lived. With honor." And then she turned and walked away, her heart pounding, the letter clutched in her hand like a sword. When she found Henry, he was at the old stables preparing to leave. The rain soaked through his coat, his face pale but determined. "Arabella," he said softly, startled to see her, "you shouldn't be here." She stepped closer, holding out the letter. "You are the rightful Duke of Pembroke." He stared at her, confused. "What are you—" "Your father married your mother in secret," she said breathlessly. "Edward forged his claim. This—" She pressed the parchment into his hand. "Is proof." He opened it slowly, reading by the light of her lantern. The words blurred before his eyes, his breath catching. "He knew," he whispered. "He knew, and he let me believe—" She reached for his hand. "He let you doubt yourself so he could rule without challenge, but you mustn't let him win." He looked at her then, and the storm reflected in his eyes. "Arabella, if I claim this, I destroy my brother." She shook her head. "You won't destroy him. Truth will." For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly he closed the letter, rainwater dripping from his sleeve. "And what of you?" he asked. "If I do this, they'll tear you apart. They already call you a fallen woman." She smiled faintly. "Then let them. I would rather be ruined for love than remembered for obedience." Something in him broke, or perhaps something healed. He reached for her, his hand trembling against her cheek. "You've more courage than any man I've ever known." She met his gaze steadily. "Then prove it. Take back what's yours." By dawn, word spread through the estate. The Duke had vanished, leaving his title, his wealth, and his pride behind. And by the time London awoke, Henry Pembroke, the brother who had once been overlooked, the man called a bastard, had been declared the true Duke of Pembroke by royal decree. Beside him stood Arabella, no longer a pawn in anyone's promise, but the woman who had rewritten history with truth. And though the world would gossip for years to come, it could never deny one thing, that sometimes love does not follow the path written in ink, but the one written in courage. The morning the truth was made public, Pembroke Hall no longer felt haunted. The heavy air that had clung to its corridors, years of pride, deceit, and silence, seemed to lift like mist from the fields. Servants walked with lighter steps, laughter returned to the kitchens, and sunlight poured through windows that had once remained shuttered. The world beyond the estate gates might have been roaring with scandal, but within these walls there was peace. Henry Pembroke, now the rightful Duke, stood at his father's study window, watching the dawn gild the horizon, his coat hung open, his cravat undone. He looked nothing like the image of nobility his brother had worn so perfectly. But there was a steadiness in his eyes, a kind of quiet authority that came not from birthright, but from integrity. He had not sought the title, he had never wanted to rule, and yet as he gazed upon the vast lands of Pembroke, he understood that perhaps fate had always meant him to rebuild what arrogance had destroyed. The door opened softly behind him. He didn't turn. He already knew who it was. "You should rest," Arabella Whitmore said gently, her voice warm but tired. He smiled faintly. "I might say the same to you." She crossed the room, pausing beside him at the window. Outside, the roses were blooming, crimson, ivory, and soft blush, just as she had requested when she dared to replant the neglected gardens weeks before. The scent of them drifted through the open glass. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that a title defined a person, that being a duchess meant duty and grace and composure." "And now?" he asked. She looked up at him, her eyes soft with light. "Now I think it means choosing the right man, not the right name." Henry turned toward her fully, his expression unguarded. "You've done more for this house in a single month than I could in a lifetime. You've given it honesty and life." She smiled, a real smile, one that carried both grief and joy. "And you've given it heart." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Not the uneasy silence of restraint, but the comfortable kind that belongs to people who have survived the worst of themselves together. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Arabella, I cannot offer you perfection, only peace. And perhaps a little happiness, if you'll let me." Her eyes shimmered. "I've had enough of perfection to last a lifetime. Peace will do." He laughed softly, that rare, gentle laugh she had come to love. Then, taking her hand, he said simply, "Then be my duchess. Not by contract, not by obligation, but by choice." Her answer was wordless. She stepped forward, her fingers tightening around his, and kissed him. Slow, tender, unhurried. It was not the desperate kiss of the terrace, nor the uncertain one of secrecy. It was calm, deliberate, the kind of kiss that built a life. When they parted, the light had changed, brighter, fuller, as if the world itself had been holding its breath. Their wedding was small. Scandal made grand gatherings impossible, but neither of them wanted one. The ceremony took place in the rose garden beneath an arch of ivory blooms. The vicar spoke softly. The air smelled of rain and redemption. Henry wore no crown, no ornate sash, only a simple silver pin that had belonged to his father. Arabella wore no jewels, only a ring of white blossoms woven through her hair. As they exchanged vows, there was a kind of reverence between them. Two souls not beginning anew, but continuing a story rewritten by truth. "I, Arabella Whitmore," she whispered, "take thee, Henry T. Pembroke, not as the Duke I was promised, but the man I found." He smiled, his voice steady despite the tremor in it. "And I, Henry Pembroke, take thee, Arabella, not as my possession, but as my equal." The kiss that followed was met not with applause, but with quiet, a silence so complete it felt sacred. And somewhere, Above the flowers and the sighing wind, the first lark began to sing. Life at Pembroke changed in ways subtle but profound. The once stern household became a place of warmth. The servants no longer feared to laugh. The gardens flourished, the village prospered, and for the first time in decades, the doors of the great hall were opened to everyone on feast days. Arabella kept her word. She was not the kind of duchess who ruled through decorum, but through kindness. She visited the orphanage she'd once spoken of, taught children to read, and turned part of the estate into a school. When people whispered about her scandal, she met them with grace, because she no longer lived for their approval. And Henry, though he carried the title now, ruled not as a duke born to power, but as a man who had earned it through humility. He restored what his brother's pride had broken, rebuilding trust among tenants and kin. Yet when he returned home each evening, and Arabella met him at the door, he was never the Duke of Pembroke. He was simply Henry. One evening, months later, they stood together on the same terrace where they had once been discovered, the night that had nearly destroyed them both. Now the air was quiet, the moonlight soft. "It feels different now," Arabella murmured, running her hand along the stone railing. "Once, this place was the end of everything. Now it feels like the beginning." Henry looked at her, eyes bright with love. "That's because we stopped letting others write our story." She smiled and began writing it ourselves. He reached out, brushing a loose curl from her cheek. "Do you ever regret it? The scandal, the whispers, the pain?" She thought for a moment. "Sometimes when I think of who I used to be, the girl who believed her future was written in contracts and titles. But then I remember who I became because of it. And no, my lord, I regret nothing." He drew her close, his forehead resting against hers. "Good," he whispered, "because neither do I." The next morning, Pembroke Hall stirred with life. The clatter of breakfast trays, the chatter of children playing in the courtyard. A letter from London arrived on fine parchment, addressed to their graces, the Duke and Duchess of Pembroke. Inside was an invitation from the Crown, a gesture of reconciliation. Henry smiled as he handed it to Arabella. "It seems we've been forgiven." She laughed softly, folding the letter aside. "Let them forgive. We already have." They walked out into the gardens hand in hand, the roses brushing against their sleeves. Sunlight spilled across the path, warm and golden. For the first time, Arabella truly felt what her father's promises had never given her: freedom. As they paused beneath the arch where they'd wed, she turned to him, eyes shining. "Do you remember what you said the first day we met?" He frowned, amused. "That you were dreadfully proper?" She laughed. "No, after that?" "You said armor keeps both swords and sunshine out." He smiled. "And you lowered yours." "I did," she said softly, "and found home beneath it." He kissed her then, sunlight gleaming on their joined hands, no longer bound by arrangement or duty, but by choice, by truth, and by love that had survived every lie. And in the distance, Pembroke Hall glowed, not a monument to lineage, but a living thing, beating with laughter, forgiveness, and the sound of forever.